Okay, Jim's not here, but of course he had a lot to say. So he asked me if I would read the introduction. And he has some questions that he's kind of hoping that Greg will help us answer. They're actually general questions about America today. The first one is, why is America rich but has twice the child poverty rate of most of the other 27 countries in the European Union? Why are the lifespans of American men on the average nearly 3 years less than men in the European Union? And why is that gap widening? Why does the World Health Organization rate US healthcare 27th in the world, even though we spend far more per capita on healthcare than any other nation? Why did nearly twice the number of Americans die per capita in the recent COVID pandemic than in most other industrialized first world countries? Why does America have an incarceration rate 4 times higher per capita than the European Union, Australia, Canada, England, or Wales? The list of questions could go on, but you get the idea of what he was thinking about. He says that he doesn't think the answer is that Americans are dumber, fatter, lazier, blacker, browner, whiter, or more criminal than citizens of other countries. He thinks that the root reason may be that our general legislative impotency has created vicious, destructive political divisions, and for some reason we allow this to happen. He's hoping that Greg, a doctoral student in sociology at Notre Dame, can shed some light on this problem. Jim met Greg and his family when he was doing taxes at IU South Bend. And he found out that Greg's specialty is depolarization of politics. And of course, Jim was immediately interested. And he was going to ask him if he could come, but he volunteered. So isn't that great? Greg has a really great background. He's published on the role of religion in families, theories of family change in modern society, and he's written papers on the topics of arranged marriage, ethics in relationships, and one that I asked Greg about, lyrical sociology, which is something, as far as I could see, something to do with emotions in sociology, but he could probably tell us more on that. Greg has an MS and a BA in sociology from Brigham Young University in Utah. He's taught classes on family sociology, introductory statistics, data analysis, and social problems. And he's presented his work at meetings of the American Sociology Association, the National Council of Family Relations, and the Society for Scientific Study of Religion. Wow. Greg is a member of the Church of the Latter-day Saints. There'll be, as Harvey said, a question and answer period just right after the service. We're going to go right into that. So, okay, Greg, solve all of our problems.
Well, thank you for having me out here. Can you hear me okay? If I stand normal like this, can you still hear me? Oh, am I too tall?
You're not too tall. Just need to really
Oh, okay. Cool. Well, does that work? We good? Okay, great. Yeah, Jim really set me up nicely because I'm gonna make the claim today that solving polarization is the problem that if we solved could solve every other problem. So like you said, the list could go on and on about all these different social problems, but how we solve them is always a community effort, and how we work together to solve problems it doesn't work when we're polarized. So I'll get into that. But first off, I wanted just to say who I am. So I appreciate the introduction. Some other things on there is that I live in South Bend, and I have a wife and 2 kids. We've lived in the area for about 5 years, probably be staying a 6th year. And they like Vicky said, I'm a member of the Church of Jesus Christ Latter-day Saints. But my dad actually attends Unitarian Universalist churches, both in Phoenix and now in Virginia. He grew up Catholic and then became atheist, but has kind of bounced around between Unitarian Universalist and Humanist churches. And my mom was a member of the Church of Jesus Christ Latter-day Saints, and so and my dad is also much more liberal and progressive, and my mom much more conservative. So I kind of grew up with different politically and religiously mixed parents, which perhaps explains some of my interest in this topic. And so yeah, a little bit about I guess my research. First off, why I got into sociology. As part of the Mormon church or whatever, we're asked to serve missions, and you don't get to decide where you go. And I got sent to Detroit, Michigan, actually, Spanish speaking. And I was there for 2 years, and that was a lot different than Gilbert, Arizona, which was ranked like the 2nd safest city in the nation at one point. And I mean, of course, I was super afraid to go when I originally got called, but I kind of went on faith, and just had a transformative experience, to say the least. And before my mission, I was going to be, I was taking classes to go to school to be a doctor. But after my mission and just seeing all the social problems, I changed my major to sociology, because I thought, well, if I can prevent people from killing each other in the first place, maybe they won't need to go to the doctor, or whatnot. So that's kind of what got me into sociology. And my interests have kind of shifted along the way. I did a lot of work on like family and religion too, but when it was time to actually propose my dissertation, it was right during the 2020 election, and COVID, and everything was polarization. And so I was thinking like, oh, that could make a good dissertation topic. But I actually had never really done much on politics, because I guess maybe just growing up with politically mixed parents or whatever, I just kind of just stayed away from the whole political realm. But now I am deeply into politics, not in the sense of like I know a lot about politics, who everyone is, who said what, and things like that, but thinking about how to solve some of the problems within politics that lead to other problems like we've talked about. So yeah, so my dissertation specifically is on depolarization. And I intentionally framed my work on depolarization as opposed to polarization, which a lot of political scientists study, because I want to understand depolarization not as like the opposite of polarization, but as something that is like oriented towards its like own distinctive type of good. And then I'll say that's like later on is the logic of love. It's kind of like in the conflict resolution literatures, this idea of positive peace. Peace is not the absence of conflict. Conflict is the absence of peace type of idea. And I'm studying my dissertation doing surveys amongst the mass public, and in-depth ethnographic research and interviews with one depolarization organization, Braver Angels. And also I'm doing like a network analysis of of all the different organizations using Twitter data. So yeah, so today I don't want to bore you guys in the nuances of scholarly arguments, but I want to give practical advice, because Jim said that like many people here, and I don't know if I'm allowed to do like a raise of hands, but who here would say that they have some political differences with someone that matters to them in their life? Okay, so most people. So I want to focus on the practical level, and then I also want to take this opportunity of presenting my work in a church setting like this to talk about more spiritual things. And I guess, where am I at on time wise? When do I need to be done? Oh, okay, 2 hours then. Got this.
We usually end around 11:30.
11:30.
But don't stress.
Okay, all right. Yeah. So yeah, but before I get into like the practical, I just want to like just explain just briefly like kind of this state of polarization, and kind of how it's understood. So um, scholars typically talk about polarization in three different ways. One deals with like the extremity of belief. So take any issue, like say abortion. People can say like there's absolutely no abortion is possible no matter what circumstance, or you could have like abortions up to like birth or whatever. Like you could, and then there's like everything in between. And so one way of measuring polarization is looking at like the distance between beliefs on like one particular issue. Another way of measuring polarization is the consistency of beliefs on one side. So if your belief in one thing, say immigration, predicts your belief in another thing like climate change, we can see that there's a trend that beliefs are starting to kind of coagulate around like different parties, and so they call that like sorting or alignment. And so that's another type of polarization. And there's also not just beliefs that sort of sort into parties, but also different identities too. And then the last type of polarization isn't about beliefs, but it's about how you feel about those who believe differently than you. And that's what's called affective polarization in the literature. And it's more a moral and emotional evaluation of people who believe differently than you. And so that is the type that is most concerning to scholars, is the growth of affective polarization. Because as I'll talk about later, like ideological polarization to some extent may not be a bad thing. Differences in opinions and kind of hashing them out may be healthy for democracy. And so there's a huge documented rise of affective polarization. There is definite increases in the alignment or consistency of certain beliefs predicting other beliefs, but the extremity of people's beliefs is actually not as bad as people might think. A lot of Americans, like I'll talk about later, actually have more moderate views than we realize. So, and we can see like increases in polarization, what sort of consequences that have, like with January 6th and other events on the national scale, but also like in our personal relationships. There was one study where I think it was a bunch of computer scientists. They looked at cell phone data, and they were able to track people who had to go have Thanksgiving dinner in an area that was like more cross partisan. They spent 30 to 50 minutes less time together at their Thanksgiving dinner. And so just this idea that like polarization is like creating these sort of real world consequences on a massive scale. And like anecdotally, like I said, during the 2020 election, I saw my friends and family hashing it out on social media. And also my religiously and politically mixed parents, they eventually got divorced. And so yeah, I mean, who knows reasons why, but like there's definitely challenges in living together with differences. So I'll transition now to talking about the practical things of what we can do about polarization. Um, so in the so there's a lot of organizations that have arisen to try to respond to this increasing polarization, and there's a bunch of different approaches to depolarization, and they're preferred differently by different people. But some of these approaches are oriented around finding consensus about specific issues, and this is through like debating. There's approaches that focus on hearing the other side's story, which invokes empathy for the other person. There's ones that focus on getting people together to do something that's unrelated to politics, because it's this theory of contact theory, where it's like just doing something will make you not hate each other as much. And so it's explicitly non-political. There's other approaches that teach specific communication skills, which is what I'm going to kind of elaborate on here shortly. There's approaches that help people to find common ground, so by kind of getting people to talk and point out similarities. And then there's more, I guess, broader approaches, ones that work towards institutional change of political and media institutions, ones that encourage people to collaborate and work together on solving local issues from across the political spectrum, and then other organizations that help to advocate for political elites to work together, compromise and whatnot. But I'm going to focus on some of these practical ways to talk about politics. So these like communication type of approaches, and a lot of these ideas come from what I've learned from studying this organization, Braver Angels, which was started by two people. One of them was a very well-known family scholar, marriage and family therapist, and basically he took the principles and techniques of marriage and family therapy, and he applied them to healing the relationships between Republicans and Democrats. And they hold workshops across the country and are growing rapidly, and people are finding lots of success. And there's been scientific studies that have shown that their interventions, they reduce polarization, and so these techniques work. So and the main theory that this organization embodies, and that I'm going to talk about here, is that if we can change the way that we listen and speak to one another, we can be less polarized or create less polarization. So it's learning to listen and speak in a depolarized and depolarizing way. And these different listening and speaking techniques can be broken down into like the content of what you actually talk about, and also the form of how you communicate. So in terms of listening and the content, one thing, like I talked about, is it's helpful to actually just hear what people believe, because like I said, most people actually aren't as extreme in their beliefs. People drastically overestimate how extreme the other side is. And if you just simply ask them, like, hey, what do you believe about this issue? You might find that they're actually not as extreme. And correcting those misperceptions leads to depolarization. Asking people why they believe what they believe gets at the sort of question of values and experiences. And sometimes when people explain why they believe what they believe, you might find out that you have similar values, just different, and similar goals, just different ways of achieving them. And if you hear their stories and about their different life experiences that have led them to believe what they believe, this can also provoke empathy, because you might be able to say, oh wow, if I had those similar life circumstances, I might believe just like they do. And lastly, in terms of like learning how people came to their beliefs, so finding out like where they get their sources of information, and also why they trust those sources of information, that can be telling as well, because if you were in the same media environment as them, you might have similar beliefs about what's real and not real too. So all that is helpful. Now, in terms of how to listen, one thing that the Braver Angels organization will always say is the best way to change someone's mind is with your ears. So it's listening is kind of fundamental in the whole communication process, and it's listening to understand, and not aiming to convince the other person, but really seeking to understand first before you seek to be understood. And to understand, a lot of times you have to sort of bracket your own beliefs and do everything you can to open yourself up to the other person and hear them on their own terms. And when they start talking, you seek to give them the benefit of the doubt, see the good, look for overlap, like we've talked about. And also, listening can also take the form of speaking, in the sense that you can ask good questions. And when you ask questions, these aren't what sometimes are called gotcha questions. They're not questions that are meant to like lead them, or they have like a hidden motivation or agenda where you're trying to, put them, make them look bad. But they're sincere questions that are asked out of genuine curiosity, and connection. And also, there's this technique of active listening where you can, when you hear what the other person says, you can restate it in your own words, to make sure that you're understanding them correctly, which also it helps you to make sure you're actually understanding correctly, because you can think you understand something, but then once you speak it, then you really understand. So those are techniques about how to be a good listener, that can help make conversations go better. And similar to active listening is, and now we're kind of making the transition into speaking, when you're in a conversation, is what's called steel manning. So steel manning is opposed to straw manning, but it's basically engaging the best form of their argument as possible, rather than the worst form, which is just easy to attack, such that you can present their argument in a way that's better than they could themselves. And you see this happen where someone will like really engage in a conversation, and they'll say it back, and the person will be like, wow, like yeah, that's actually what I believe. You said it better than I could. And so, but that takes a very intense focus and sincerity of really trying to understand them in their best light. So then, like, this is where it gets into like the really like nuts and bolts and mechanics of a conversation. I think the transition stage from listening to speaking is sometimes like the hardest and maybe the most important part. And if it's like a really heated relationship already, there's some techniques that can help in that transition from when the other person's talking, you're needing to respond. And both of these techniques kind of slow the conversation down, because a lot of times conversations go bad when people just start going back and forth and it gets really fast and no one's taking the time to restate what they think and things like that. But something else is where you prepare the person, before you just go into your point. You say, now I'm going to offer my perspective. And just doing that little thing, it slows the conversation down and it gets the person to be ready to hear you. And if the underlying relationship is not good in the first place, you can even ask for their permission. Like, would you like to hear my perspective? I see that this is important to you. Would you like to hear my perspective? And sometimes they'll just say no. And then you just say, okay, would there be another time where we could talk about this? You can go there, or you can just leave it for another time when maybe they're willing to say yes. But it's giving them that invitation allows them to sort of accept, and they'll be more open to actually listen to you if they're sort of, instead of you just like saying, well, this is what I think, type of thing, even though that is like a form of preparation. So yeah, this is the transition. And so when it comes to like what you actually speak about, it's helpful to be as honest as possible, of course, and state what you yourself believe. and not just say things that maybe you are just, you're not just like repeating the lines that you heard from like your favorite media head or whatever, or you're just like saying like the cliche things from your party, but you're really sort of like honestly and sincerely engaging in good faith about like, this is actually what I really believe. I'm not just saying this because I'm a Democrat or a Republican. I'm saying this because like this is what I like really believe. And also remembering that like the purpose of this conversation is to inform them, not to try to convert them to your way of thinking, to transform them, because they can feel that pressure. If they are going to change, it has to come from the inside out, and you're trying to just provide them with the right information and the right relational conditions in order for them to kind of come to these conclusions themselves. And also recognizing that in these conversations, you don't want them to have, when you're speaking, you don't want to have it be like a performance, where you're not using like different types of rhetoric to try to like get them to manipulate them into thinking what you think. And also these conversations are often better one-on-one in a private setting, rather than like in front of co-partisans or whatever. Like if both sides have different people, like, and they're trying to like not look bad in front of their group, then it's just going to be a lot of like performance if there's an audience. And so a lot of times, like if it's during in a public setting or at a family reunion or Thanksgiving dinner, and stuff comes up, you can say like, hey, I'd love to talk about this with you sometime. And then you could like set up a time where you can talk one-on-one, rather than going at it at the table where everyone's listening and watching and everyone's joining in. It just gets chaotic. And lastly, in terms of kind of what to say, like obviously like relying on evidence and good reasoning practices is crucial. And also hedging. So using hedging language. I mean, in debate, they tell you to be confident and just go with your point. But in depolarized conversations, it's better to use hedging language and say like probably as opposed to definitely, or many rather than all, kind of avoiding generalizations and stereotypes, or it seems or it appears, and also just the basic like humility of a response that's just like an I don't know response. In one Braver Angels debate, they were talking about abortion, and there was a speaker, a conservative lady from Texas, who was speaking against abortion, and she gave her speech, and then like they had like questions from the audience. This was over Zoom, and someone asked about like abortions for like teenagers, and the lady kind of just sat for a while and said, I don't know. Like after all that she said before, at this point she just said like, I don't know. And she said that she has a teenage daughter, and if that happened to her, then she doesn't know what she would do. And everyone, like the debate moderators, they kind of realized like that when this person just kind of said I don't know and just like stopped for a second and just acknowledged that, rather than just kind of coming out with some argument in defense of her position, like the whole mood of the debate shifted. So humility can go a long way. All right, and so the last part of these like kind of real practical techniques are to translate things, like as you're speaking, pay attention to how it's being received. Like what if you're using jargon, think about like, oh, like maybe they don't know this term. So kind of translate things into their language. There's also the use of I statements, where instead of like you make me angry, you say like I feel angry when. that instead of trying to blame the other person, you take ownership of your own feelings. Another thing is so this is not engaging with people from the other side, but engaging with people on your own side about the other side. A lot of times, like, there's sort of in-group dynamics where you can maybe feel like a sort of sense of solidarity when you're like joining in, bashing people on the other side. But this isn't effective, and it takes a lot of integrity to sort of stand up for people you don't believe in. But all of this can help to bring about depolarization. And then just avoiding personal attacks, ad hominem, things like that. One of the former leaders of our church said that you should never let a problem to be solved become more important than a person to be loved. And so always remembering that this person's a person and that they're more than their ideology or their identity. So this gets into the spiritual segment, and this is like kind of the last part. And I'm gonna just read something from the leader of our church. We have like annual conferences every two or twice a year, and Jim invited me to share religious perspectives as well. And it was great because the talk that our president and prophet Russell M. Nelson gave was on becoming peacemakers. And so he talked about before he was a church leader, he was a heart surgeon. And I'll just kind of read what he said. He said, during my surgical internship years ago, I assisted a surgeon who was amputating a leg filled with highly infectious gangrene. The operation was difficult. Then, to add to the tension, one of the team performed a task poorly, and the surgeon erupted in anger. In the middle of his tantrum, he threw his scalpel loaded with germs. It landed in my forearm. Everyone in the operating room, except the out-of-control surgeon, was horrified by this dangerous break of surgical practice. Gratefully, I did not become infected, but this experience left a lasting impression on me. In that very hour, I promised myself that whatever happened in my operating room, I would never lose control of my emotions. I also vowed that day never to throw anything in anger, whether it be scalpels or words. Even now, decades later, I find myself wondering if the contaminated scalpel that landed in my arm was any more toxic than the venomous contention that infects our civic dialogue and too many personal relationships today. Civility and decency seem to have disappeared during this era of polarization and passionate disagreements. Vulgarity, fault-finding, and evil speaking of others are all too common. Too many pundits, politicians, entertainers, and other influencers throw insults constantly. I am greatly concerned that so many people seem to believe that it's completely acceptable to condemn, malign, and vilify anyone who does not agree with them. And there's social scientists who talk about how the norms around how we talk about people who are groups that think differently than us are not as well established. Like, there's things that we feel comfortable saying about like the other political side that there's norms around that we restrain ourselves from talking about other sorts of groups in those similar ways. And so it might just be a process of like developing these norms of saying like, you know what, like it's not okay to like call these people on the other side, call them all like X or whatever, like type of insult. So those can be established. So anger never persuades, hostility builds no one, contention never leads to inspired solutions. Regrettably, we sometimes even see contentious behavior in our own ranks. We hear of those who belittle their spouses, children, and of those who use angry outbursts to control others, and of those who punish family members with the silent treatment. We hear of youth and children who bully and employees who defame their colleagues. My dear brothers and sisters, this should not be. As disciples of Jesus Christ, we are to be examples of how to interact with others, especially when we have differences of opinion. One of the easiest ways to identify a true follower of Jesus Christ is how compassionately that person treats other people. There's a story I heard about if someone ever asks you, like, are you a Christian? The best response you can give is to say, ask my neighbor. And so I think, so what a lot of what I'm saying today, it does come down to embodying these best practices, but not just like doing these techniques, because I think the techniques come natural when you're in the proper relationship with someone. When you treat the other person as a person, and you see them for all of who they are, and you don't reduce them to their political beliefs, you'll start to be able to engage with them in a different and a more productive way. And so the solution to all of our problems is to change the way that we interact with one another. Because if we start here, it can influence outward. And this doesn't mean that we have to necessarily change our own beliefs. One participant in one of these Braver Angels events said that after joining Braver Angels and going through their programming, he's actually more convinced that he's right in his views, but that his ability to talk with other people who think differently than him has improved drastically. And so that's kind of what we're aiming for. And I guess I'll just end with this quote by Jimi Hendrix. When the power of love overcomes the love of power, the world will know peace. Thank you.